From URL Media, I'm Mitra Khalida.
And I'm Sarah Lomax. Today we're discussing the Great Retrenchment. It's what we're calling the greatest assault on Black political power in decades.
In this episode of Twice as Good, we examine the Great Retrenchment that's unfolding in courtrooms across the country. While some state courts are moving to protect voting rights access, we're seeing the most conservative Supreme Court in nearly a century out of step with the American people. What can be done to stop it?
We have two brilliant guests today. First, lawyer Madiba Dennie. Her upcoming book is called The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back.
And welcome to Brandon Tensley. He's the national politics reporter at Capital B News. Capital B is a nonprofit newsroom based in Atlanta, Georgia, and a partner of the URL Media Network. I want to start us off by taking us back into history with a powerful quote from Frederick Douglass. And I think this quote is really apt because I often invoke Frederick Douglass when I'm invoking the need for BIPOC media, meaning media that is for our people, by our people. So Madiba, could you read the quote that you begin your book with?
Sure thing. Yeah, at the very beginning of the book, which I have a copy of here, it starts with an epigraph from Frederick Douglass. And this is a quote from a speech he gave in response to the Dred Scott decision on May 14th, 1857. And the quote reads, "We the people, not we the white people, not we the citizens or the legal voters, not we the privileged class and excluding all other classes, but we the people, the men and women, the human inhabitants of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution."
And Madiba, just refresh our memory on when he said this and what the historic significance of this is.
So this was in 1857, after the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. That was the case where the court declared that not only were Black people not citizens, they also were not able to become citizens. No legislation could make them such. And it was pretty dramatic, even given the standards of the 1800s.
I just want to bring us into 2024 and the rollbacks that we've been referencing that take us back decades, potentially even further than that. Madiba, could you just characterize this moment in terms of these conservative attacks on DEI, where they're coming from, and more specifically, the money and political power that's working to overturn our rights?
So the conservative legal movement is the really dedicated group of actors here. They have worked to reformat the courts, basically repopulate them with people who adhere to this philosophy called originalism. Originalism means that the meaning of the Constitution is fixed at a point in time. It is unchanging, and it can only mean today what it meant 200-ish years ago when it was written, which I might add is the same logic that was used in the Dred Scott decision that Frederick Douglass was rebuking in that quote we started off with. The court had said in that case, well, the founders clearly didn't mean to include Black people within We the People, or else all of their other actions wouldn't make sense. And of course, they're sensible. So that means that your interpretation is wrong and Black people are categorically excluded from We the People. And it's that same style of reasoning that has seen a resurgence as part of a backlash to civil rights gains. It's very intentional. It's not that originalism happens to yield conservative results. It's that they are choosing to use originalism in order to achieve these results.
Brandon, I wanted to pull you in here for two reasons. One, I think the Supreme Court, which you've written about, is playing an active role in what Madiba is talking about once again, both in the decisions that it's choosing to hear as well as those where it's refusing to intervene. And you reported on a case involving the leader of Black Lives Matter. I just wondered if you could relate that story for us.
Right. So this was a recent decision, as you said, Mitra, for the Supreme Court not to intervene with a case involving DeRay McKesson, a prominent Black Lives Matter figure who he was involved in a Black Lives Matter protest in 2016, where a police officer was very seriously injured, and the police officer said that McKesson should be held accountable because he should have known or suspected that violence could occur. And I think it's also important to say this was a protest after the fatal police shooting of Alton Sterling. And so really what this does is create this sort of chilling effect, right? Where if you think that you could be penalized in some way because of a protest, of a gathering, a demonstration that you're putting together, then that will dissuade you from gathering to protest against injustice or anything like that. And I think it's also important to say this was the Fifth Circuit, which I'm sure, as Madiba knows, I see her shaking her head, is known for its arch conservatism. So that's a little bit about that particular case.
So I wanna pivot to you, Madiba, because we're talking about voting rights. We're talking about this originalism at the Supreme Court level, and there's so many issues that are before the Supreme Court or before the courts in general that are rolling back our rights. And I wanted to see if you could try and connect the dots for us, because everything's happening all at once. There's the rollbacks around reproductive justice, abortion, and IVF, and access to contraceptive care. There's the overturning of affirmative action. There's, the equal marriage status that's being questioned and rolled back, and voter rights, and all of these things seem to be like elevated at a level that I've never seen before, all at the same time. But we're often asked to look at them separately. And I wanted to see if you might be able to connect the dots on how all of these things, including climate change, are connected, and how they are being interpreted at the Supreme Court level.
Yeah, I think they are all part of the same overarching project of consolidating power within the hands of a few, and further entrenching, as I think you had said earlier, the great retrenchment, further entrenching these historical power structures that have existed. And you can sort of do all of that at once by taking power away from everyone and allotting it solely to this narrow subset of typically white wealthy men, also typically a certain type of Christian, and only that group gets control over what books you can read in schools, or when you can or must have a child, or who you can marry, or what kind of regulations the government can create to stem climate change. All of these things have to do at their core with power and a reactionary grasp from people who have traditionally had power in this country feeling threatened. And so originalism sort of arose as a way to dress up in legalese this type of reactionary power grab by saying, actually, it's, if to read the Constitution correctly is to roll back the clock, because the only proper legitimate way to understand the Constitution is how it was understood hundreds of years ago. So we should just go ahead and reset everything and discount all of the advances we've made. So it's seems like everything is happening at once because it's one sweeping move to reconsolidate power and just sort of pull everything back that we fought for.
I'm just curious because it feels like the stakes, and we hear this a lot, the stakes are so high, democracy's on the ballot, all of those things. But at the same time, it feels like there's a numbing out, and there's a sense of futility, and nothing really is going to ever change. And I'm wondering, and this is for you, Brandon, and you, Madiba, in terms of like what the media can do to break through both the noise and the numbness that exists around such critical issues that for so long people have taken for granted, people have assumed were codified and just embedded into the fabric of American law and life. But they're very much under threat now, and I'm just wondering like what we can do, particularly from a media standpoint, to better like make the case that these things are actually in peril? I'll start
Yeah.
with you, Brandon.
Something that we think about a lot at Capital B is how do we show the stakes for these issues that might sort of seem detached from people's everyday lives. So one issue that I talk about or write about constantly is gerrymandering. And so gerrymandering is this kind of dry sounding concept, boring. Why should we care? But I think also, as Madiba was getting at, um, gerrymandering literally can affect everything that you do. I remember talking with a source in North Carolina one time, and he was like, "I don't care what your issue is, gerrymandering is your issue. Whether you're talking about climate change, access to abortion, whether you're talking about voting rights, whether you're talking about gun control legislation, but all of these things are baked into the weight of your vote."
We're seeing so many conflicts of interest at the Supreme Court level right now with Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, and these very human political positions that these justices are supposed to not be engaging in or aligning themselves with. What are the things that might be necessary to reconstitute the Supreme Court so that it is not becoming just another partisan part of our political system?
Well, I wanna take this in a couple different parts. Regarding term limits, there absolutely should be term limits, but I want to slightly push back against the framing of reforms that can make the court less of a political body. I think it could potentially be less of a partisan body, but the court is inherently a political body. It's always been a political body because the decisions that it makes have such significant impacts on our political system. There's also court expansion. I think that these would work well in tandem as sort of diluting the power of any individual justice if you have more justices and they're not there forever. And I also try to present in my book interpretive changes as well. So just like changing what they have the power to do, and also saying when you do have power, how are you a good steward of that power? Like, what are the ways you should exercise it? What's the bounds of acceptable behavior?
I wanted to turn to you, Brandon, because I think we also want to understand what are some concrete things that we can do to fight back and to kind of balance out a very well-funded, well-organized, patient right that is at the core of these rollbacks. And you wrote a book, an article for Capital B, and it was talking about the Minnesota Voting Rights Act, and that was kind of a win to and we're seeing that different states are starting to instill or put into practice these voting rights acts on a state by state basis. So talk a little bit about what you're seeing, how these local or statewide coalitions are organizing effectively to fight back against the kind of the federal rollbacks around voting rights.
Yeah, that Minnesota State Voting Rights Act is very recent, and was a direct sort of reaction to a decision last fall that came out of the Eighth Circuit. So it was a redistricting case in Arkansas that would affect Minnesota as well. And you had legislators in Minnesota who were just like, we need to do something because if, what that case was saying was uh, private entities, essentially. So individual citizens, voting rights groups, for instance, NAACP, which was involved in Arkansas in the case, can't bring lawsuits under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But that is one thing that some people are doing. I did a reported piece a few months ago out of Pennsylvania, and specifically going to Harrisburg to look at sort of what organizers were doing to reach out to Black voters, specifically Black voters who were maybe outside of Philadelphia or somewhere like that, where like a lot of resources often get pumped into in election years. And a state voting rights act came up there as well. I was sitting in on it was a voter training at a high school, and the organizer had a whole slide about the importance of Pennsylvania Voting Rights Act.
I'm curious, Madiba, same similar question. The Supreme Court and their approach, this effort to revert back to this originalism interpretation of the Constitution and all of that seems to be gaining traction. And what can the other side do to mobilize or to fight back on both an individual level and a systems level? What can people do to try and advocate for these very important rights that are being rolled back at this time?
I think it's important to recognize that the Supreme Court does not actually have a monopoly on the Constitution, that regular people still have the authority, the responsibility even, to say what the Constitution means to them. And so if they are opposed to what the court is doing, if they are disagreeing, they should still pursue what they think is constitutional, whether that's by working on legislation at the state level, as Brandon mentioned, or doing sometimes questionable legality work anyways. Like I'm thinking about some of the abortion funds groups that say abortion is still a constitutional right. I will always be able to exercise my right to abortion, and so I'm going to help people access that anyway. I think that's a form of resistance that's valuable. I think making the Constitution a campaign issue, saying a lot of state judges, for example, are elected, saying, I'm not going to vote for any judge who's originalist, or saying, I'm not going to vote for any senator who confirms originalist judges. And so I think basically seeking out any and all opportunities to create the type of constitutional world that we want to see. I think that it sounds a little abstract, but this is really a thing that people have done before. My favorite example probably is the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm not convinced that the Supreme Court would have held the segregated bus system in Montgomery, Alabama unconstitutional, if not for all of the people who had been saying for over a year that they were boycotting the Montgomery bus system because of the segregated bus system and because they thought it violated their rights. So I think that people should declare what their rights are, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, and act accordingly.
And if I could add,
go ahead, Brandon. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one really quick thing that I think is important to bring up. So Capital B, we recently kicked off our Black Political Power Tour in Oakland, and one thing that came up during a panel that I think relates to this was a thank you tour that I believe they did in Georgia. It was the New Georgia Project after the 2020 election, and it wasn't just thank you for voting, but it was really because of your vote, we will be able to get an infrastructure bill passed. This infrastructure bill will allow you to have more hospitals, more roads, more schools. That maneuvering of connecting what the right to vote actually, what the right to vote means sort of abstractly. We talk about democracy, holding people to account, but then showing because you did this, because you held people to account, because you put these people in office, because you voted for this set of policies, we were able to get these kinds of things passed.
I completely agree that affirmative vision and taking those kinds of steps is so important.
Yeah, I also heard from you, Madiba, and this relates a little bit to the founding of URL in 2020 into 2021, but really the moral clarity that institutions and individuals need to have. So there might be systems not designed for us, but the demand for either our own systems or systems that include us or both, that work continues. In moments like this, is it better to be in organizations like ours that are for our people, by our people? Is it to be in mainstream institutions and keeping an eye on what's happening and informing the rest of the world? Is it that watchdog role? Is it fighting for inclusion? I think after 2020, a lot of organizations like ours were born with this belief that things would change. So I'm just wondering if anyone has thoughts on that aspect of retrenchment.
That's a really good and a really tough question. Because I think it depends so much. Like there's so much value in having spaces like these where you actually get to hear these voices that are excluded from other places. That there's also value in making sure that, like, creating an inroad for those voices at other places. Granted, sometimes those other places act like you're going to have a new paved road, and then you get there, it's a dirt road, or it's just like the road doesn't exist. So it truly depends, I think, on the conditions of those places and how amenable they are to various kinds of agitation.
I think it also comes down to maybe what kind of fight you want to have. Being at a legacy media organization entails a different kind of fighting for coverage of particular issues and the character of coverage for particular issues versus being, I think, at the organizations that we have. We do still fight in other ways. Maybe our battles just look a little bit different. And so similar to what Madiba was saying, I would never discourage somebody if the battle that they want to have involves like, I want to shake up this like really big institution. I think for other people, they're like, that's not my fight. I want to fight on this level. So I think it also depends on just how you want to exert your energy.
Yeah. I would just add it's both and. I think that we need to be everywhere. I think that we need to have our own spaces where we own and control and can develop and experiment and provide opportunities to other people to grow in these media organizations. But I also think we have to be in the big mainstream places, but with a caveat. If you are in a mainstream organization, you need to use your voice. You can't just keep your head down and like go along to get along. If you're there, if you have the opportunity to be at the table, you need to represent the voices and the concerns and the experiences of people who are marginalized, who will never, maybe ever be at that table. We can't just be at these tables and just co-sign things that can be harmful to our people. So we've got to be courageous wherever we are and be an advocate and for our people wherever we are. That's what I would say.
That's right.
I mean, Sara, you invoke Frederick Douglass as probably more than I do. I'm wondering if you want to close this out there or if there's anything else.
Well, when I think of Frederick Douglass as we move into the summertime, I think of, his famous 4th of July, that 4th of July, that was not for Black people. And so, I just believe that we need to carry the spirit of Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and, so many other warriors who were at the forefront of our fight for liberation. And it's far from over. So we all need to embrace and tap into that spirit because we need to really be ready for battle because it's on. So.
Well, I wanna add another Frederick Douglass thought.
Yeah, please.
Because this was something I really appreciated and I think really informed my writing of the book. That I found, and it's escaping me now whether it was like a newspaper piece or a letter or what have you. But he had this great line where he was basically talking about the idea of the original intent and how, as Garrison said, the Constitution was like a compact with death. And he was talking about all of the flaws in the document, which there are for sure. But he also said, basically, why should the slaveholders get to tell me what the Constitution means? He goes, should I let these wicked men twist it in support of wickedness? And then he said, if there's any doubt as to what something means, you should always pick the thing that's helpful and the thing that protects people and like furthers rights. And I think that's a very important message for us to take with us.
Excellent.
Brandon,
well, thank you. Oh, yeah, Brandon.
So I just pulled up a quote, not Frederick Douglass, but sticking on the theme of history. It's a James Baldwin quote. And he said, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it. History is literally present in all that we do. And so, a lot of what we've been talking about on this episode is how we're still litigating some of these same battles when it comes to power, when it comes to representation. We're still sort of invoking these figures from the past because what they said is very salient to what we're seeing today.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the reasons why history is under attack, why people don't want us to teach or know our true history, because it does empower you. It does allow you and arm you with the skills and the perspective to fight and to know what's right, because we keep fighting these fights over and over and over again. I want to thank both you, Brandon Tensley and Madiba Dennie, for being with us today. This is Twice as Good. And we are so grateful for Madiba Dennie, author of the new book, The Originalism Trap, How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back, and Brandon Tensley, national politics reporter at Capital B News. I'm Sara Lomax, co-founder and president of URL and president and CEO of WURD Radio. For independent news from our 32 Black and Brown outlets, visit our website, url-media.com. You can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube for our future episodes. We look forward to seeing you next time.